She arrived in Wyoming with $2, a cracked leather bag, and a letter that said she was no longer welcome in her own family. 19 years old, alone, sent to cook and clean for a man she had never met, in a house full of children who hated her before she ever walked through the door. Most women would have turned back. Abigail Hartwell stayed, and before that winter was over, she would ride into a blizzard that could kill her, nurse 5 sick children through the darkest nights of her life, and face down the aunt who abandoned her, not with tears, but with fire. This is the story of the girl nobody wanted, and the family that changed everything. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. You won't regret it. The train station at Laramie smelled like coal smoke and animal waste, and the wind coming off the high plains had teeth in it. Abigail Hartwell pulled her coat tighter and tried to look like a person who knew what she was doing. She didn't. She had never been west of Ohio in her life, and everything about Wyoming in November felt like a warning. The flat gray sky pressing low against the earth, the mountains in the distance so large and indifferent they barely seemed real, the cold that slipped through every gap in her clothing and settled against her skin like a wet hand pressed there on purpose. She was the last passenger off the train. That felt about right. She stood on the platform with her bag at her feet and the letter folded inside her coat pocket, the one Aunt Clara had pressed into her hand 6 days ago with the expression of a woman completing an unpleasant errand. You'll work for a Mr. Gideon Mercer. He's a widower, 5 children. He needs someone who can cook and keep house. You'll have room and board. Don't embarrass us. That was it. No embrace, no we'll miss you, not even a proper goodbye at the door. Clara had turned back into the house before Abigail reached the end of the front walk, as if watching her go would cost something she wasn't willing to spend. Abigail had understood then, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that she was being disposed of. Her parents had died of typhoid 3 years prior, and for 3 years she had lived in that Columbus house as something between a guest and a hired girl. Never quite family, never quite not. She'd cooked their meals and minded their children, and kept herself small and grateful and undemanding, and it had not been enough because Clara's eldest daughter was getting married and needed the spare bedroom, and Abigail had become a problem that needed solving. So, Wyoming, a stranger's name on a piece of paper. She picked up her bag and went inside the station to wait. The man who came for her was not Gideon Mercer. He was a ranch hand named Eli, somewhere past 50, with a beard that hadn't seen scissors since the previous winter, and eyes the particular gray of old wood. He held a piece of cardboard with Hartwell written in large, uneven letters, and when Abigail walked toward him, he looked her up and down once and said, without enthusiasm, "You're smaller than I figured." "I work fine at this size," she said. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, and took her bag from her without asking, tossing it into the back of a buckboard wagon with no particular care. "Climb up then. 2 hours out. Cold will get worse before it gets better." She climbed up. He wasn't wrong about the cold. By the time the last edge of Laramie disappeared behind them, the wind had found a new register. Not just cutting now, but pressing, sustained, with nothing on the open plain to interrupt it. Eli didn't talk much. He passed her a wool blanket from under the seat, which she accepted without any pretense of not needing it, and occasionally pointed out landmarks with the tone of a man identifying fence posts. "That ridge there is Harlan's Cut. That creek is the Sweetwater. Don't drink from it in spring." She absorbed it all. She had learned young that information was the only currency she had reliable access to, and Wyoming was going to require a great deal of it. The landscape was extraordinary in the way a difficult truth is extraordinary. Not comfortable, not exactly beautiful, but impossible to look away from. The plains rolled in great undulating swells, brown grass flattened by wind, the mountains to the west growing sharper as the light shifted, their upper slopes white with snow that hadn't melted since September. The sky above it all was enormous in a way Ohio skies simply weren't, and despite the cold and the ache in her feet and the general uncertainty of her situation, Abigail found herself tilting her head back to take it in. She thought, I could be nothing out here, or I could be something. The land doesn't care which. She wasn't sure if that was comforting or terrifying. Probably both. The Mercer Ranch came into view around a bend in the frozen road, and her first impression was of a place that had once had someone who loved it and didn't anymore. It wasn't falling apart exactly. The fences were repaired, Badly, but repaired. The barn was solid. The main house was 2 stories of rough timber with a porch running the length of the front and a thin line of smoke coming from the stovepipe. But there was a quality of holding on about it rather than thriving, the kind of maintenance that keeps collapse at bay without making anything better. A wagon wheel leaning against the porch railing that nobody had moved in some time. A pile of firewood that needed splitting, sitting untouched. Curtains drawn tight in the windows, even in mid-afternoon, as if the house had decided it preferred not to look out. Eli pulled up in the yard and called toward the house. "She's here!" The front door opened and 5 children appeared. They didn't come out. They arranged themselves in the doorway and on the porch steps and stared, and Abigail, who had grown up an only child, felt the full concentrated force of that stare and made herself hold it. The oldest was a girl, maybe 15 or 16, with dark hair pulled back tight and an expression that made her look 40. Arms crossed over her chest, jaw set at an angle that communicated, without any words whatsoever, that she had already decided about this, and the decision was not favorable. Behind her stood 2 boys close enough in age to be mistaken for twins, 10 or 11, one watching Abigail with frank curiosity, the other staring at the porch boards. Then a girl of 7 or 8 with her thumb hovering near her mouth, not quite in it, breaking a habit she was apparently trying to quit. And behind them all, half hidden behind the oldest girl's leg, a small boy of maybe 4 or 5 with enormous brown eyes showing white around the edges. 5 faces. All of them asking the same question without speaking it. "Who are you, and are you going to leave?" The oldest girl spoke first. "You're the new housekeeper." She said it the way a person says you're the one who tracked mud on the floor. A category. A box to be placed in and managed. "I'm Abigail Hartwell," Abigail said. She didn't add anything because adding things too quickly looked like nerves. "I'm Hannah." The girl's chin came up. "I've been running this house for 14 months. I know where everything is and how it works. I don't need help." The curious boy said, "Pa says you do," and Hannah's elbow found his ribs without her looking at him. "Where's your father?" Abigail asked. "Barn," Eli said from behind her. "Go introduce yourself. I'll get your bag." She walked to the barn. Gideon Mercer was working on a horse's rear shoe with the concentrated focus of a man who had decided that if he applied himself hard enough to one specific problem, he could avoid thinking about everything else. He didn't look up when she came in. He was bigger than she'd expected, broad across the shoulders, working in his shirt sleeves despite the cold, with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were scarred from years of use. 35, maybe older. Difficult to tell. His face, when he finally looked up, was the face of a man who hadn't slept adequately in a very long time. Not just recent nights, a long stretch of them, the kind of tiredness that settles into the bones and becomes structural. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Abigail Hartwell. Your aunt wrote to my aunt." He straightened, wiped his hand on his pants, and extended it. His handshake was firm and brief, the handshake of a man with other things to do. "She wrote that you have some experience with household work." "I do." He took stock of her the way Eli had, measuring against some internal threshold, and then nodded. "Room and board, $3 a month. You'll cook, clean, help with the children. The oldest has been managing, but it's too much for one person. She'll show you where things are." "She doesn't want to," Abigail said. He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. "No," he said. "She doesn't." "That's all right," Abigail said. "I'll figure it out." He studied her for a moment, and she couldn't read what was in his eyes exactly. Not warmth, not hostility either. Something more like wariness. The careful look of someone who has had the floor give way before and no longer trusts solid surfaces. "Mrs. Mercer passed 14 months ago," he said. "The children have had a difficult time." "I'm sorry," she said. She meant it. "I'm not looking for—" He stopped, started again. "This is a working arrangement. The children need someone. The house needs keeping. That's what this is." "I understand," she said. She did. He wasn't looking for a savior or a replacement for anything. He was looking for someone to do a job so his family didn't continue coming apart. It was the most honest set of terms she'd been offered in 3 years, and she appreciated the plainness of it. She left him to his work and went back to the house. The kitchen was a disaster. Not filthy. Hannah was clearly trying, and trying hard. but it had the disorganized desperation of someone handed too much responsibility too young and managing by force of will without any proper guidance. The larder was poorly arranged. The firewood beside the stove was low and cut wrong. There were dishes stacked but not properly clean, and a pot on the stove that had been on too long, something scorched at the bottom, the smell of it mixing with wood smoke and cold. Abigail stood in the doorway and took it in. Hannah appeared behind her. "I didn't say you could come in here. I live here now, I'll need the kitchen eventually." She crossed to the stove and lifted the pot lid. The stew inside was salvageable, barely. It needed water and something to cut the bitterness. She went to the larder, found what she needed without asking, added water and salt and a pinch of dried marjoram, turned the heat down, and replaced the lid slightly ajar to let the steam escape. "What did you put in it?" Hannah's voice was sharp. "Water, salt, marjoram. The bottom was scorching." "I knew that." "I'm sure you did," Abigail said, and she just said it, no edge to it, and went to look at the firewood. From the other room came small feet. The youngest boy appeared in the kitchen doorway, the one who'd been hiding behind Hannah's leg, and stared at Abigail with his enormous, careful eyes. "Hi," she said. He said nothing. He pressed himself against the door frame and watched her. "That's Thomas," said the voice behind him. The curious boy materialized from somewhere, the way children do. "He doesn't talk much since Mama died. He used to talk all the time. I'm Willie. I'm 11. How old are you?" 19. "That's old," Willie said with complete sincerity. "Hannah's 16 and she already acts old, but you actually are. Can you make biscuits? Hannah's biscuits come out like rocks sometimes." He glanced sideways at his sister. "Not every time. Sometimes." "Willie?" Hannah said. "I'm just saying." "Don't." "I can make biscuits," Abigail said. Willie looked at her with the evaluating eyes of someone conducting a serious assessment. "Better than rocks?" "Usually." He nodded, grabbed an apple from the bowl on the table, and wandered back out. Thomas stayed a moment longer, his expression too careful to read, and then he was gone too. Hannah came to stand near the stove with her arms crossed, watching Abigail the way a guard watches a perimeter. Abigail moved around the kitchen with deliberate calm, learning where things were by looking, not by asking, because asking would just produce an argument. After a while, she said without turning around, "I'm not trying to take your place." "You couldn't," Hannah said immediately. "You're right, I couldn't." She said it simply. "I'm not your mother. I'm not trying to be. I'm not replacing anything. I'm here to help." Hannah's jaw tightened. For just a second, beneath all that hard composure, she looked very young and very tired. "People say things like that," she said. "It doesn't mean anything." "I know," Abigail said. "You'll have to watch and see." Her room was small. A bed, a washstand, a single hook for her coat, but it was hers. And after 3 years of sleeping in a room that always felt borrowed, the smallness didn't bother her. She sat on the edge of the narrow mattress that first night after the house went quiet and let herself feel the full weight of where she was. Wyoming. 5 grieving children who didn't want her. A man so buried in exhaustion he barely occupied his own house. And outside, the wind, steady and indifferent, testing the walls. She thought about what she had going for her. She was 19 and healthy. She was not afraid of hard work. She knew kitchens, and she knew houses, and she knew how to be useful before she could be loved, because she'd had years of practice at it. She had survived 3 years in a house that didn't want her, and she knew how to stay in a room where she wasn't welcome without making it anyone's problem. It wasn't much. It was something. She set her parents' photograph on the washstand, her mother's hand on her father's arm, both of them squinting into the camera light the summer before they died. And she said into the small, dark room quietly, "All right." She didn't know exactly what she meant by it, something like "I'm here," something like "I'm not leaving." She lay down and pulled the blankets up and listened to the house breathe. The creak of cold wood, the sound of a child turning in sleep somewhere above her, the low moan of wind under the eaves. She did not sleep for a long time. The first week was not easy. That was a significant understatement. She was up before the light every morning to build the fire up for members because the house bled heat overnight, and by dawn the temperature inside wasn't dramatically different from outside. She made breakfast, oatmeal mostly, eggs when the chickens cooperated, biscuits twice that came out better than rocks, though not her best work either. The children ate in formations that told her things. Willie sat wherever he felt like and talked throughout every meal. Thomas took the corner chair and kept his eyes on the table, always close enough to Hannah to touch her sleeve if he needed to. Peter, the quiet 10-year-old, and Nora, the 8-year-old, sat across from each other and communicated in a private code of small glances and gestures. Hannah sat at the end of the table and presided over all of it, and watched Abigail with the steady attention of someone expecting an error. Abigail made errors. She burned the porridge on the third morning and had to throw it out with the children already sitting at the table. She couldn't find the good skillet for 2 days because it was stored somewhere Hannah hadn't mentioned. She overloaded the laundry water and lost an hour reheating it. She absorbed each mistake and corrected it and didn't apologize more than once for any of them. The dynamic between her and Hannah that emerged was not warm, but it was honest. Hannah told her where things were when directly asked, and not otherwise. She corrected errors with blunt efficiency. She would not be cruel. Whatever else she was, she'd been raised better than that. But she would not soften, not 1 degree, and Abigail understood it and did not push. She wasn't sure she would have softened either in Hannah's position. Gideon moved through the house like a large, careful ghost. Out before first light, back after dark, the ranch always demanding something. He ate what she put in front of him without comment in either direction, said thank you and good evening with the regularity of a man reminding himself of the ordinary forms of exchange and finding them slightly foreign. He was not unkind. He was just absent in some essential way. Body present, most of himself somewhere else. She didn't try to reach whatever was elsewhere. It wasn't her place. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She focused on what she could do. She fixed the firewood situation. She reorganized the larder. Hannah watched from the doorway with her arms crossed, and Abigail did it anyway because it needed doing, and asking permission would only produce an argument. She mended 4 of Peter's shirts, sitting by the lamp in the evenings. She found Thomas's carved wooden horse with its snapped leg and repaired it with wire and patience and set it beside his plate at breakfast without saying a word about it. He picked it up, examined the repair carefully, and put it in his pocket without looking at her. She marked it as progress. It was Willie who cracked first, which surprised her. She'd expected Nora. But Willie appeared in the kitchen doorway one afternoon while she was making bread and said, "Can I help?" "You know how to make bread?" "No, but I could learn." She moved over and made room for him. He was spectacularly bad at it. No sense of how the dough should feel, no instinct for pressure, flour on himself and the floor, and somehow on the wall. And he talked without stopping about a horse he'd been trying to befriend and a rabbit he'd spotted near the east fence and whether she thought it would snow before Christmas. She answered all of it, showed him what to do with his hands, didn't care about the flour on the wall. When the bread went into the oven, he said, "Can I help again tomorrow?" "If you want," she said. He considered her for a moment with the serious authority of an 11-year-old delivering a final verdict. "You're okay," he said. Then he went back outside. She stood alone in the kitchen while the bread began to smell like bread, and the hammer rang somewhere in the yard, and the wind pushed against the house, and she thought, "You're okay." She'd take it. The note was in the Bible. She hadn't been looking for it. She'd been dusting the shelves in the sitting room, a task neglected long enough that the dust came off in sheets. And the Bible was on the 3rd shelf, and when she moved it, a folded piece of paper fell out. She picked it up, started to put it back without reading. The handwriting on the outside stopped her. "For whoever keeps this house after me." She stood holding it for a long moment. Then she opened it. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone. And that means this family needs you. I want you to know some things." Hannah is fierce because she's afraid. She's been afraid since she was small, afraid of losing things. And now she's lost the thing she was most afraid of losing. Be patient with her. She is so much braver than she knows. Willie is easy to love. Let him be. Peter is the quiet one. He feels everything and says nothing. Watch his eyes. If he's all right, you'll see it there. Nora sucks her thumb when no one is looking. She thinks she's too old for it. Let her think she's hiding it. Thomas stopped talking after. He'll talk again when he's ready. Don't push. Just be there. Gideon will not ask for help. He will not tell you what he needs. He will work himself until he breaks, rather than admit he's breaking. I don't know how to fix that. I tried for 12 years. Just don't give up on him. And you, whoever you are, whatever brought you here, I don't know your story, but I know something about it. You didn't come to in November for any easy reason. This family is worth loving. I promise you that. Thank you for staying. Eleanor Mercer. She folded it and sat down in the nearest chair and held it between her hands and stayed there for a long time. She thought about the woman who had written this, knowing she was dying, knowing she was leaving, and thinking not of herself but of 5 people and a stranger who might someday come. She thought about Hannah's fierce arms and Thomas's careful eyes and Willie's flower-covered hands and the thumb Nora thought no one noticed. She thought about Gideon in the barn with his face full of a tiredness that had no bottom to it. She didn't cry. She came close. Then she folded the note carefully and put it back in the Bible and went back to dusting. It was the end of her second week when she found Nora on the back porch steps after bedtime, sitting in her nightgown in the dark in 20-degree cold, looking up. Abigail grabbed her coat and went out and draped it over the girl's thin shoulders. "Nora, it's freezing. What are you doing?" Nora looked up at her. Her eyes were wet. "I wanted to see the stars. Mama used to bring me out when I couldn't sleep." The sky was clear for once. An absolute wash of stars, the kind a person from Ohio doesn't quite believe until she sees it, dense and cold and brilliant from one horizon to the other. Abigail looked at it and then sat down on the step beside Nora. The cold cut straight through her skirt. "Which ones did she show you?" she asked. Nora's finger traced shapes in the air. "She knew all the names. I don't remember them all. Do you know them?" "Some. Not all." She pointed out Orion's belt, Betelgeuse burning reddish-orange, the close cluster of the Pleiades. "Those are the 7 sisters, 7 stars, at least 7 you can see with just your eyes. There are more, but your eyes can't find them." "That's sad," Nora said, "that you can't see them even though they're there." "Maybe. Or maybe it's something that they're there even when you can't." Nora thought about it with her whole face, the way children do serious things seriously. Then she leaned very slightly sideways, not quite against Abigail, just fractionally in her direction, like a plant tilting toward warmth without meaning to. Abigail stayed very still and made nothing of it. "I miss her," Nora said. Completely plain, no defense around it. "I know," Abigail said. "That makes sense. Hannah says we shouldn't talk about it because it makes Papa sad." "Hannah is trying to protect your Papa. She used to hum when she worked. Mama did. I keep thinking I hear it, and then I listen, and it's not there." Abigail felt something tighten in her chest that she didn't try to name. "Come on," she said, putting her arm around Nora's narrow shoulders. "Let's go in before you lose a toe and have to hop everywhere." Nora made a small surprised sound that was almost a laugh. Abigail got her inside and tucked back into bed with an extra blanket. And when she checked back 10 minutes later, Nora was asleep. Her thumb was just barely near her mouth. Abigail stood in the doorway of that small room for a moment, looking at the sleeping child. Eleanor Mercer had known about the thumb. She had written it down in a letter for a stranger, so the stranger would know. So the girl could keep her small, private habit without shame. Such a small thing to know about a person. Such an exact and particular love. Abigail went to her room and sat in the dark and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed. She thought about what it meant to be so completely known by someone that even your smallest hiding places were accounted for. She thought about what it meant to lose that. She thought about 5 children walking around in this house carrying that loss every day, while their father carried his own version of the same thing, all of them too close to it to reach each other. She had come here with $2 and a letter that said she wasn't wanted. She had expected to cook and clean and survive. She had not expected Eleanor Mercer's handwriting. She had not expected Thomas's carved horse, or Nora's sideways lean, or Willie's flower on the wall. She had not expected to sit on a freezing porch in November pointing at stars while a grieving 8-year-old leaned into her shoulder like she'd forgotten she was supposed to hold herself apart. She had not expected to want to stay for reasons that had nothing to do with having nowhere else to go. Outside, the wind pushed at the house, same as always, but she lay down that night and pulled her blankets up and thought about Eleanor's letter. "Thank you for staying." And for the first time since the train pulled out of Columbus, the cold felt like something she was on the right side of. She was still there in the morning. She built the fire. She made breakfast. She let Willie put too much flour on the wall. She stayed. 3 weeks in, Abigail found a second note. This one was tucked inside the cover of a recipe book on the kitchen shelf. A slim, handwritten volume that Eleanor Mercer had clearly assembled herself, the pages soft with use, the spine cracked in 3 places. Abigail had pulled it down looking for something to do with the dried beans in the larder, and when she opened the cover, a folded slip of paper fell into her palm. It was shorter than the first note, just a few lines in the same careful handwriting. The bread recipe on page 12 is Gideon's mother's. He won't ask for it. Make it on a hard day. He'll know what it means. That was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just that one specific instruction delivered across time from a woman who had known her husband well enough to leave a map of him for a stranger. Abigail stood in the kitchen for a moment, holding the slip of paper, and then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket beside the first one. She was collecting them now, these small dispatches from Eleanor. She didn't know how many there were. She didn't go looking for them. She found them when she found them, in the natural course of moving through the house and doing the work. And each time one appeared, it felt less like discovery and more like conversation. Like Eleanor was still here, in some way that had nothing to do with presence and everything to do with having paid close enough attention while she was alive. She turned to page 12. The bread was a dense, slightly sweet pull-apart loaf, made with molasses and a particular fold technique she'd never seen before. It took most of the afternoon, and it came out imperfect, slightly uneven in the rise, a little dark on one side where the oven ran hot, but the smell of it filled the entire house in a way that stopped things. She heard Willie pause on the stairs. She heard Peter come in from outside and stand in the kitchen doorway without saying anything. She heard, from somewhere above her, the sound of small feet crossing the floor and stopping. She put the loaf on the table for supper. Gideon sat down and looked at it, and something happened in his face that was there and gone so fast she almost missed it. Not grief, exactly. Something older than grief. Recognition. He didn't say anything about it. He cut a piece and ate it and said, "Thank you," in the same tone he used for everything, and then he was quiet for the rest of the meal. But after the children had cleared out and she was washing the dishes, she heard him behind her and turned to find him standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, not wearing it, just holding it. "Where did you find that recipe?" he asked. "The cookbook on the shelf," she said. "Is that all right?" He was quiet for a moment. "That was her mother's," he said. "My mother's. Eleanor learned it from her." He turned the hat in his hands once. "I haven't had it since before she got sick." Abigail didn't say anything. She had learned in the past 3 weeks that sometimes the best response was just staying in the room. "It was good," he said. And then he put his hat on and went back out, even though it was past 8 o'clock and dark, because apparently there was something in the barn that needed checking, or maybe because he needed somewhere to be that wasn't a kitchen full of the smell of his dead wife's bread. She finished the dishes. She didn't feel sorry for him in the pitying way. She felt sorry for him the way you feel sorry for someone carrying something genuinely heavy, which is to say, she felt the weight of it alongside him and wished she could do something useful about it. She couldn't yet. So she washed the last dish and hung the cloth and went to make sure Thomas's fire hadn't gone out. December came in like it meant to stay, which in Wyoming it did. The temperature dropped in a sustained, serious way. Not the theatrical plunges of a storm, but the quiet, grinding cold of a winter that had settled in and intended to see itself through. The ground froze to iron depth. The water in the outside trough had to be broken up every morning before the animals could drink. Abigail added an extra layer under her coat and moved through the morning chores with her breath-making clouds in the cold air. And she stopped complaining about it to herself, because complaining to yourself is the least productive form of the activity. The children were inside more, which meant the house held them all in closer quarters, which meant Abigail learned things about them she might not have otherwise. She learned that Peter, the quiet 10-year-old, read everything he could get his hands on and had a particular passion for anything related to machines. He had a battered copy of an engineering manual that he carried around like other boys carried pocket knives, and he would sometimes read passages aloud to no one in particular, not performing exactly, just working through something he found interesting. She learned that Nora was fiercely competitive about checkers and would absolutely not admit to being fiercely competitive about checkers, and that Willie, who was bad at sitting still, had developed the habit of whittling as a compromise between moving and not moving, producing small, lumpy shapes that were supposed to be animals, and occasionally were. She learned that Thomas, who still hadn't spoken to her directly, had a relationship with the barn cat that was the most expressive she'd seen him. He would sit in the barn with the cat in his lap and talk to it in a low, continuous murmur, words she couldn't make out from the doorway. And she never went closer because it was his, that small private world of the cat and the murmuring, and it didn't belong to her. She learned that Hannah woke up at 5 o'clock every morning, not because she had to, because she couldn't sleep past it, because there was too much in her head, too much responsibility she'd taken on and couldn't put down. Abigail started getting up at 5 too, which meant they were sometimes the only two people awake in the house in the cold dark of early morning, working alongside each other in a silence that was gradually becoming something other than hostile. Not friendly, not yet, but less armed. One morning, Hannah came downstairs and found Abigail already at the stove with coffee made, and she poured herself a cup and stood at the counter and drank it without saying anything for a while. And then she said, "The butter needs churning today." "I know," Abigail said. "I was going to do it after breakfast." "I'll do it," Hannah said. "We can both do it." Hannah looked at her sideways over her cup. "I don't need help." "I know you don't," Abigail said, "but it goes faster with two." Hannah drank her coffee. A long pause. "Fine," she said, like she was conceding something significant. Maybe she was. They churned butter that afternoon in a silence that had work in it rather than friction, and it did go faster. And at the end of it, Hannah put the finished butter into the crock without comment, but she also poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked and set one in front of Abigail. It wasn't a declaration of anything. It was just coffee. But Abigail wrapped her hands around the cup and thought, there it is. There's the edge of it. The third note turned up in the linen closet, written on the back of a torn envelope and tucked into the stack of extra blankets. Hannah sleeps with the door open 3 inches. She'll say she doesn't. She does. She needs to hear the house breathing at night. Leave it. Abigail stood in the linen closet for a moment, holding the envelope. Then she went down the hall and looked at Hannah's door. 3 inches. Exactly. She had noticed it before and thought nothing of it. Assumed it was an accident, a latch that didn't catch properly. Now she understood it was deliberate. Now she understood the girl who presided over the table and held everything together with rigid hands was also, at night, lying in the dark listening to the sounds of her family so she'd know they were still there. She left the door alone. She never mentioned it. It was the first week of December when things cracked open a little with Peter. She'd come in from the cold to find him alone in the sitting room, the engineering manual open on his knee, his face wearing an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Frustrated, and then embarrassed to be caught being frustrated. He closed the book quickly. "I wasn't doing anything," he said, which was exactly what children say when they've been doing something they think they shouldn't. "What are you reading?" she asked. "Nothing." He held the book with both hands like he might protect it. "Can I see?" He hesitated. Then he held it out, watching her face carefully. She took it and looked at the page he'd had it open to. A technical diagram of a water wheel mechanism with explanatory text that was dense and not simply written. "This is complicated," she said. "I know." He looked at the floor. "I can't figure out the part about the gear ratio. Pa doesn't know about this kind of thing. Hannah says it's not important." "Hannah is wrong," Abigail said. Peter's head came up. "It's important if it matters to you. What are you trying to figure out?" He looked at her for a long moment, checking something, and then he took the book back and found the page and started explaining. He talked for 20 minutes without stopping, faster and more words than she'd heard from him in the entire 3 weeks she'd been there, his hands moving, pointing at diagrams, going back and forth between pages. She understood maybe half of it. She said so. He explained the other half, slightly slower. They sat together on the floor of the sitting room while the cold pressed against the windows, and she asked questions that she genuinely didn't know the answers to, and he answered them with the particular satisfaction of someone who rarely gets to talk about the thing they love best. When Willie came in and found them like that, he stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Peter's explaining gear ratios," Abigail said. Willie made a face. "That sounds terrible." "It's actually interesting," Abigail said, and she meant it enough that Willie looked uncertain, and then came and sat down on the edge of the group with the air of someone reserving judgment. She didn't solve anything for Peter that afternoon. She didn't need to. She just sat on the floor and let him talk, and when he finally went quiet and looked down at the manual in his hands, he said, without looking at her, "Nobody usually wants to hear about it." "I do," she said. He nodded, short and tight, the way his father nodded. He gathered his book and stood up. At the door he paused. "Thank you," he said, formal and a little stiff and utterly sincere. She thought about Eleanor's note. He feels everything and says nothing. Watch his eyes. She had watched his eyes all afternoon. They had been, for those 20 minutes of gear ratios and water wheels, completely, uncomplicated, alive. Progress. She marked it. Christmas was coming, and nobody in the Mercer house had mentioned it. She understood why. It would have been Eleanor's first, or rather, the first one since Eleanor. Those firsts are the hardest ones. Every person who has ever lost anyone will tell you that. The first Thanksgiving, the first birthday, the first Christmas. The shape of the absence becomes most visible when you're supposed to be gathered around something, and the thing that held the gathering together is gone. Gideon showed no sign of acknowledging the approaching holiday at all. He moved through his days with the same focused avoidance he brought to everything except the immediate practical demands of the ranch. Hannah had taken her cue from her father, apparently because she too said nothing, and the younger children, Willie excepted because Willie couldn't not notice things, had taken their cue from Hannah. Willie came to her in the kitchen one afternoon with the specific energy of someone who has been not saying something for too long. "Are we doing Christmas?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "What do you want to do?" He looked surprised that she'd asked him what he wanted. "We always did Christmas," he said. "Mama made it." He stopped. "We always did it," he said again, differently. "I'll talk to your father," she said. She hadn't sought out a conversation with Gideon about anything that wasn't strictly domestic since she'd arrived. She'd brought him meals and reported on household needs, and answered his questions directly, and that had been the full extent of it. Going to him about Christmas felt different, felt like stepping over some invisible line into the territory of his private decisions. She went to the barn. He was mending a harness by lamplight, his hands moving with the automatic competence of someone doing a familiar thing while thinking about something else. He looked up when she came in. "Miss Hartwell." "Mr. Mercer." She didn't approach closer than the first stall. "I wanted to ask about Christmas." He went still for a moment. His hand stopped. "What about it?" "Willie asked if you're planning anything. I didn't know what to tell him." Gideon looked down at the harness in his hands. A long pause, the kind that had a lot of thinking in it. "We didn't do much last year," he said. "Didn't seem right." "I understand that," she said. "But Willie's 11, and the little ones—" She stopped herself. It wasn't her place to tell him what his children needed, except that she'd been living in this house for a month, and she knew exactly what they needed, and he didn't, not fully, because he was too inside his own grief to see around it. "They're children," she said, more carefully. "They notice." He rubbed the side of his face with the back of his hand. "You want to do something. I want to know if you'd object." He looked at her directly for one of the few times since she'd arrived. His eyes, in the lamplight, were just tired. Not cold, just tired in a way that had layers to it. "Do what you need to do," he said. "Is there anything—" She hesitated. "Is there anything Eleanor did that you'd want kept? A tradition. Something that mattered to them?" He went quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "She read to them on Christmas Eve, all of them piled on the floor together, whatever book she had. Not Christmas stories necessarily, just she'd read to them and they'd all be in one room." "I can do that," Abigail said. He nodded, looking back at the harness. She left him to it. The week before Christmas, she made paper chains with Nora and Thomas. Thomas, who still hadn't spoken to her, but who sat at the kitchen table and methodically looped strips of colored paper with a seriousness that was almost funny and certainly perfect. She let him work at his own pace. She didn't talk directly at him, just kept up a light-running commentary on what she was doing, the way you keep a fire from going out, not stoking it aggressively, just feeding it steadily. Nora chattered enough for both of them anyway, moving between Abigail and Thomas with the comfortable ease of a child who has learned to fill silence on behalf of someone who can't. Willie cut pine boughs and dragged them in from outside and distributed them around the house with no particular system, which resulted in pine boughs in places that made no practical sense, including one on the kitchen windowsill that she kept bumping with her elbow. She left it there. Peter disappeared for 2 days into the barn and emerged on the 23rd of December with a carved wooden star, technically proficient and slightly lopsided, which he presented to no one in particular by setting it on the table. "For the top of something," he said, without meeting anyone's eyes. "If anyone wants it." Hannah put it on top of the tallest pine bough without comment. It was lopsided and slightly rough, and exactly the right thing. Christmas Eve arrived cold and starless, the sky pressed down flat with clouds that promised snow before morning. After supper, Abigail settled the younger children in the sitting room with blankets on the floor, as Eleanor had apparently always done, and she chose a book from the shelf, a collection of adventure stories, not Christmas stories, exactly as she'd been told, and she sat in the chair by the lamp and started reading. Willie sprawled across most of the available floor. Nora built herself a nest of blankets. Thomas sat pressed against the side of the chair Abigail was in, not touching it, just close, the closest he'd been to her since she'd arrived. Peter sat cross-legged with his back against the wall, pretending to read his engineering manual, not reading it. Hannah sat in the doorway, not in the room, not fully outside it, exactly at the threshold, leaning against the doorframe with her arms not crossed for once, just at her sides, listening. Abigail kept reading. She did not acknowledge Hannah's presence in the doorway because she understood instinctively that acknowledging it would end it. This was Hannah finding a way to be in the room without having decided to be in the room yet. That was fine. The doorway was fine. She read for an hour. The younger children drifted. Thomas fell asleep against the leg of her chair, having migrated there in increments so gradual she hadn't tracked when it happened, and she looked down at him. The small, serious face relaxed in sleep, the carved horse visible in his half-open hand. And she kept reading softly, even after he was out, for the others. When she finally closed the book, the house was quiet. She looked up. Gideon was standing in the hallway behind Hannah. She didn't know when he'd come in. He was still in his coat, snow on the shoulders of it, which meant he'd come in from outside recently. He was looking at the room, at the sleeping children, and the pine boughs, and the lopsided star and Thomas on the floor, with an expression she didn't have a word for. It wasn't happy. It wasn't sad exactly. It was something that held both at the same time and was neither. He met her eyes for a moment. She didn't smile at him. She didn't do anything that would make the moment into a performance. She just held his gaze for a second and then looked back at the sleeping children because they needed covering up before the fire burned lower. She tucked Thomas in. She settled Nora's blanket. She passed Hannah in the doorway. Hannah, who stepped aside to let her through without a word, and she went to the kitchen to bank the stove for the night. She was there, working at the stove, when she heard it, humming. Quiet, barely there, just on the other side of the wall in the sitting room where the children were sleeping. Low and tuneless almost. She stilled herself and listened. It was Hannah. Hannah, who had sat in the doorway with her arms not crossed. Hannah, who was now somewhere in the sitting room with her sleeping siblings, humming in the dark in a voice so quiet it was almost not a sound at all. As if she'd forgotten she was doing it, or as if she'd remembered something she'd been trying to forget. And the remembering had come out this way, soft and involuntary, like something finally exhaled after being held too long. Abigail stood at the stove with her hand on the damper and did not move. She stayed there long enough to be sure of what she was hearing. Then she finished banking the stove, quietly, and went to her room, and she did not tell anyone what she'd heard. Not then, not later. Some things belonged to the person they happened to, but she lay in her bed that night and thought about it. Eleanor's note, she is so much braver than she knows. And she thought Hannah Mercer was the bravest person she'd ever met, and the most alone, and that those two things were not unrelated. It snowed overnight. In the morning, the ranch was buried under 8 inches, clean and brutal and bright, and the children came downstairs to find it, and Willie made a sound that was embarrassingly close to a shriek and ran for his coat before he'd even put his boots on. Nora was right behind him. Even Peter went out, his engineering manual left inside for once, and stood in the yard looking at the untouched snow with a calculating expression that meant he was already designing something. Thomas came to the back door and stood looking out at the white yard, and Abigail came and stood beside him. He had his coat, but he hadn't gone out. He watched his brothers and sisters, and his breath made small clouds in the cold air. "Willie's going to fall down," she observed. Thomas watched Willie. Willie fell down. A small sound came from Thomas, not a word, not quite, but a sound that had laughter in it, or the shape laughter makes when it's just starting to come back after a long time away. She let it sit, didn't react, kept looking out at the yard. "His boots are wrong," Thomas said. She turned to look at him. He was still watching Willie, his face carefully neutral, as if he hadn't just said something, as if words were something he was testing out to see if they still worked. "They are," she agreed. He put the left one on the right foot. Thomas watched Willie. Willie fell down again. Thomas made the sound again, fuller this time, and this time there was no question about what it was. Abigail smiled at the yard and said nothing. Later, when she was telling herself the story of the Mercer Ranch, when she was trying to identify the moments that mattered, the ones that shifted something, she would come back to that. Thomas in the doorway, 5 years old, watching his brother fall down in wrongly placed boots. That small, private sound, the way words, once they start coming back, come back like water finding the cracks. He spoke to her properly for the first time 3 days later. Asked her where his mittens were. Nothing momentous. Just a question, direct and ordinary, the kind of question that assumes you belong enough to ask. She told him where the mittens were. She did not make a thing of it. December closed out and January came and the cold deepened and the house, which had begun the month as a collection of separate people sharing a space, was becoming, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and silences, and at least one morning where Hannah snapped at her sharply enough that Abigail had to go stand outside in the cold for a few minutes to keep from snapping back, something more like what a house is supposed to be. There was noise in it now, most days. There were arguments about checkers and complaints about chores and Willie's endless commentary on everything and the smell of bread on Thursdays, and Thomas asking where things were in his new, careful, testing voice. It wasn't healed, not even close. It was more like a broken bone starting to knit, functional enough to bear some weight, still tender if you pressed the wrong place, still a long way from whole. But one afternoon in mid-January, Abigail came in from feeding the chickens to find Gideon standing at the kitchen counter eating a biscuit, standing like he'd been passing through and stopped. He had a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not the tiredness, not the absence, something slightly different, like a man surfacing. "These are good," he said, meaning the biscuit. "Thank you," she said. She hung her coat and went to the stove. He ate the rest of it standing at the counter. She made coffee. She set a cup near him without making it an offer he had to respond to, just putting it within reach, and after a moment he picked it up. They stood in the kitchen in the winter afternoon light and drank their coffee and didn't talk, and it was the most comfortable silence Abigail had experienced since she arrived. Not the silence of people avoiding each other. The silence of people who don't need to fill the space. She thought about Eleanor's note. Don't give up on him. She hadn't. She didn't intend to. The comfortable silence in the kitchen that January afternoon turned out to be the last quiet thing for a long time. February came in wrong. Not the steady grinding cold of December and January, which at least had a predictable quality to it. You knew where you stood with that cold, you dressed for it, and worked around it, and it was simply the condition of being alive in Wyoming in winter. February came in with a restlessness that Eli noticed first, coming in from the east pasture one morning with his beard crusted with ice and a look on his face that was not quite worry, but was adjacent to it. "Sky's got a color to it," he said to Gideon at breakfast, jerking his chin toward the window. "Way out east. Yellow-green. Don't like it." Gideon looked out the window. Abigail looked too. The sky to the east was the color of an old bruise, not the clean gray of ordinary winter clouds, but something with a greenish undertone that made the light in the yard look wrong, flattened and strange. "How long?" Gideon asked. "Hard to say. Could be tonight. Could be tomorrow morning. Can't tell with this kind of sky." Eli drank his coffee and set the cup down. "It'll be bad when it comes." Gideon told the children to stay close to the house. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without explanation, expecting compliance. And the children nodded because they were ranch children, and they understood weather the way city children understand traffic. You respected it. You didn't argue with it. Willie, being Willie, tested the boundary approximately 45 minutes later. Not out of defiance exactly, more out of the simple fact that Willie's body had never fully accepted that staying still was a real option. He went out to the barn to check on a rabbit he'd been tracking near the east fence, which was not the barn, which was not close to the house. He did not tell anyone he was going. He was 11 years old, and it would be quick, and he'd be back before anyone noticed. He was wrong about all of it. Abigail noticed first because she went to call him for the midday meal, and he wasn't in the barn or the yard or the outhouse or any of the other close structures. She did a systematic search the way she'd learned to do things in this house, methodically, without panic, had moved considerably closer, and the temperature had dropped in a way that was no longer gradual. She went to find Gideon. He was in the barn, and she said, "Willie's not on the property," and she said it plainly because there was no useful way to soften it. He went very still for half a second. Then he was moving. He pulled his heaviest coat from the hook, his hat, his gloves, and he was calling for Eli before he'd finished putting them on. "Which direction?" he asked her. "I don't know. He was talking this morning about a rabbit near the east fence." Gideon looked at the sky. The east fence was half a mile out. The wall of cloud had turned from bruise-colored to something darker, more purposeful, and the wind had shifted direction in the last hour, coming now from the northwest with a new sharpness to it that was not the wind of before. Eli came in from the yard and looked at the sky and said nothing, which was worse than if he'd said something. "I'm coming," Abigail said. Gideon looked at her. "You're not. I know this ranch better than I did 2 months ago, and you need more than one person looking. I'm coming." "Miss Hartwell, we're losing time," she said. She held his gaze. He looked at her for 2 seconds that felt longer, and then he turned away and said, "Hannah." Hannah appeared from the house doorway, her face already tight with the specific fear of a child who has learned that fear is sometimes appropriate. "You're in charge. Keep everyone inside. Don't open the door unless it's us." Hannah nodded. Her eyes went to Abigail for just a moment. Something in them Abigail didn't have time to read. And then she pulled Thomas and Nora back inside and the door closed. They went east. The wind hit them the moment they cleared the lee of the barn, and it had gone from sharp to something with genuine violence in it, the kind that pushes back against you and means it. The sky was moving fast overhead, the clouds not drifting but driving, and the light was failing in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Gideon and Eli fanned out from each other by maybe 30 yards, and Abigail stayed between them, and they called Willie's name into the wind, which took the sound and shredded it into something barely recognizable 20 feet away. She had been cold before in her time on this ranch. She had been cold in ways she'd thought were the full extent of what cold could mean. She understood now that she'd been wrong. This was a different category. Not weather, but force. The wind pushing the temperature into something that moved past discomfort into something more physiological. The kind of cold that tells your body with genuine urgency that it is being asked to do something unsustainable. She put her head down and kept moving. "Willie!" The wind threw it back at her. She cupped her hands around her mouth and tried again, pushing as much volume into it as she could manage. Beside her, 30 yards out, she could see Gideon doing the same, and beyond him Eli, and the three of them moved in a loose line toward the east fence, scanning the ground and the scrub brush and the shallow cuts in the terrain where a boy might have gone to look for a rabbit and then gotten turned around when the sky changed. She was the one who found him. He was in a shallow depression behind a cluster of frozen scrub, maybe 40 yards south of the east fence line, curled into himself with his arms around his knees, his coat not nearly heavy enough for what the weather had become. He'd been crying, she could tell from his face, and had stopped some time ago, which was either because he'd calmed himself down or because he'd gotten too cold for it, and she didn't want to know which. When she dropped into the depression beside him, his head came up, and his face did something complicated and relieved and ashamed all at once. "I got turned around," he said. His teeth were going. "I know." She pulled her coat open and wrapped it around both of them and yelled for Gideon with everything she had. He was there in under a minute. He dropped into the depression and took Willie from her with the brisk efficiency of a man acting rather than feeling, pulling the boy inside his own coat, checking his hands and face with hands that were visibly shaking, though not from cold. He said his son's name twice, just that, just Willie, Willie, in a voice she had not heard from him before, stripped of all its habitual flatness, something raw underneath. "I'm okay," Willie said, muffled inside his father's coat. "I'm sorry. Pa, I'm sorry. I just—" "Later," Gideon said. "Tell me later." They got moving immediately because the sky had made the decision for them. What had been incoming was now arriving. The first hard sheets of snow coming in horizontally on the northwest wind, reducing visibility from the horizon to maybe 15 yards, then less. Eli materialized out of the white and took one look at the situation and fell into position on Willie's other side, the three adults bracketing the boy between them. and they went back west by feel and instinct and Gideon's knowledge of his own land, which was the only navigational tool they had left. She couldn't see the barn. She couldn't see anything past the end of her own arm with any clarity. She put her hand on Gideon's back and kept it there so she wouldn't lose him, and she put one foot in front of the other in the snow that was already ankle-deep and drifting, and she didn't think about anything except the next step. It took them the better part of 40 minutes to cover ground that had taken 15 to cross going out. The barn appeared out of the white like something willed into existence, and she had a moment, brief and real, of something that was not quite relief yet but was its precursor, the first loosening of the thing that had been held tight in her chest since she'd walked into the barn and said, "Willie's not on the property." Gideon pushed through the barn door and she followed, and the relative stillness inside hit her like stepping out of a river. She was soaked through. Her hands had stopped feeling like her hands somewhere in the last quarter mile. Willie was shaking hard, but he was talking, which was the best possible sign. Gideon set him down on a hay bale and crouched in front of him with his hands on either side of the boy's face, looking at him. "Look at me," he said. Willie looked. "Good. You're all right." He said it like it was a fact he was establishing, like saying it made it the final answer. "I really am sorry," Willie said. The rabbit?" "Willie." Gideon's voice was quiet. "I know. We'll talk about it. Right now, just sit still." Eli went to the house to tell Hannah. Gideon and Abigail got Willie warmed up in the barn before moving him. Blankets from the tack room, body heat, time. She worked on his hands and he worked on the boy's feet, and neither of them spoke for a while. The only sounds the howl of the blizzard against the barn walls and Willie's gradually steadying breath. At some point, Gideon looked across Willie at her. She looked back. She was still cold enough that her face felt stiff and her hands weren't working quite right, and she probably looked about as bad as she felt, which was not good. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated than gratitude, something that included it, but had more around the edges. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Yes, I did," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at Willie. She looked back at Willie too, and Willie, who had been following this exchange with the bright eyes of a boy who misses very little, said nothing for once in his life. They brought him inside when he'd stopped shaking badly, and the reunion in the kitchen was the kind of thing that doesn't organize itself neatly. Nora burst into tears immediately, which she would later deny. Peter stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had been methodically preparing for the worst and hadn't yet recalibrated for a better outcome. Thomas went directly to Willie and stood next to him without touching him, just next to him, close enough that their arms were almost touching, and stayed there. Hannah said nothing at all for a long moment. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at her brother, and her face went through several things rapidly. Relief, anger, more relief. The specific exhaustion of someone whose vigilance had been rewarded with precisely the crisis they'd been vigilant against. Then she said, "You absolute idiot," and pulled him into a hug that lasted long enough to say everything the words couldn't. "I know," Willie said into her shoulder. "I know, Hannah." Abigail stood to the side and let the family do what families need to do. She was aware, standing there, of being wet through and cold in a way that had passed the acute stage and settled into a deep general ache. She was aware of her hands, which were working again but felt wrong, like instruments she was operating from a slight distance. She moved toward the stove, not to cook anything, just to stand near it. Gideon appeared beside her. He had a dry blanket. She didn't know where he'd gotten it. And he put it around her shoulders without asking, the same way she'd grabbed a coat and gone to Nora on the porch steps 2 months ago, not making it a gesture, just doing it. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "Sit down anyway." She sat. He poured coffee that Hannah had apparently made while they were in the barn, because Hannah was Hannah. And he put a cup in front of her and stood back and let her drink it. The blizzard ran itself out overnight. By morning, the wind had died and the snow lay deep and still, and the sky had gone to that particular hard blue that follows a bad storm, the light bouncing off the white in a way that made you squint. The ranch was buried. The porch railing had disappeared. Drifts had built against the barn wall to the height of a man's shoulder. The work of the days after was physical and exhausting, digging out, checking the animals, repairing what the wind had damaged. Gideon and Eli were out from first light. Abigail kept the house running, and the children fed and managed the small emergencies of a household that had been shaken and not quite settled back into itself. Willie was quieter than usual, which for Willie was nearly miraculous. He did his chores without being asked twice, and he didn't complain about anything. And once, when he thought no one was watching, Abigail saw him standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the yard with an expression much older than 11. She let him have it. She didn't go and make it into a lesson or a moment. He'd been afraid out there. He'd learned something in that depression in the snow that no one could have told him and had it land the same way. Sometimes fear is the teacher, and the job of everyone else is just to stay out of the way. But something had shifted in the house. She felt it, and she couldn't entirely name it. The children looked at her differently after the storm. Not dramatically. There was no meeting, no declared change. It was in the small things. The way Peter started saying good morning when he came downstairs, which he hadn't done consistently before. The way Nora reached for her hand once, walking from the barn back to the house, casually, without making anything of it. The way Thomas sometimes came and sat near her in the evenings when she was sewing, close enough to be company, not so close as to require acknowledgement. And Hannah, who had stood in the kitchen and watched Abigail leave into the storm and had said nothing. Hannah, who had kept every child safe and the fire going and the coffee made and the house intact while they were gone. Abigail came back from checking the animals one afternoon to find Hannah in her room, not snooping, just standing in the doorway, looking at the washstand where the oval photograph of Abigail's parents sat. "I'm sorry," Hannah said when she heard Abigail behind her. "I wasn't—" "It's all right," Abigail said. Hannah looked at the photograph for another moment. "Are those your parents?" "Yes." "Where are they?" "They died," Abigail said. "Typhoid. 3 years ago." Hannah absorbed this. She looked at the photograph with a new quality in her expression. "Who did you live with after?" "My aunt." "Is that who sent you here?" "Yes." Hannah was quiet. Abigail came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence be what it was. Outside the window, the snow-covered yard was brilliant with afternoon light. "She didn't want you," Hannah said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," Abigail said. "She didn't." Hannah looked at her then. Really looked, the way she hadn't since Abigail arrived, with the guard down enough to actually see. "Do you miss them? Your parents?" "Every day," Abigail said. Hannah nodded slowly. She was working through something. Abigail could see it, turning something over in the private interior space where Hannah Mercer did all her most significant thinking. Then she said carefully, "I'm sorry I wasn't—" She stopped, started differently. "I know I was hard on you when you first came." "You had reasons," Abigail said. "I still have them," Hannah said, which was the most honest thing she could have said. "But," she stopped again, looked at the photograph. "You went into the storm. You didn't have to. You could have stayed here." "I know," Abigail said. "Why did you?" Abigail thought about it. She could have said something about duty or responsibility or it being the right thing. All of those were partially true. "Because he's your brother," she said instead. "Because he matters, that's all." Hannah was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was measured and careful, each word placed like something she'd decided on. "My mother's notes," she said. "You found them?" Abigail stilled. Hannah looked at her directly. "I know she left them," Hannah said. "She told me she was going to, before she—" A pause. "She said she was going to leave instructions for whoever came. I didn't know if anyone would actually find them, or care about them if they did." She held Abigail's gaze. "You read them?" "Yes," Abigail said. "And?" "And I tried to do what she asked," Abigail said. Hannah looked away, toward the window, the white yard, the hard blue sky. Her jaw was working. She had the look of someone fighting something that was going to win eventually, and she knew it. "She knew about the door," she said quietly. "The 3 inches. She put that in a note?" "Yes," Abigail said. Hannah made a sound that was not a laugh and not a sob, and was somehow both the sound of someone who has been completely known and then lost the person who knew them and is only now, in a strange woman's small cold room, feeling the full size of that loss. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and she stood there for a moment, and Abigail did not go to her because Hannah Mercer was not yet someone you could go to. Maybe someday. Not yet. She was good at that, Hannah said, when she had it back under control. Her voice was steady, but it cost her. Noticing things, the exact right things. I can tell, Abigail said. Hannah nodded once, short and tight. She looked at Abigail's parents in their photograph. She would have liked you, she said, which was the most significant thing Hannah had said to her in 3 months, and they both knew it. She liked people who stayed. She left the room then, her footsteps down the hall controlled and even, the door to her own room clicking shut with 3 inches of gap. Abigail sat on her bed for a moment in the cold afternoon light. She put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. Eleanor's words came back to her, the last thing she'd read in the first note, the thing she'd been trying to live up to since November. This family is worth loving, I promise you that. She'd been right. Abigail pressed her palms against her knees and sat with that knowledge, which felt large and slightly unsteady, the way important things do. 2 weeks after the blizzard, on a Tuesday morning in late February, Gideon came in from the barn at midday, which he didn't normally do. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands and didn't speak for a moment. And Abigail, who had learned to read his silences the way she'd learned the geography of the ranch, not perfectly, but well enough to navigate, poured him coffee and set it near him and waited. I want to tell you something, he said. She sat down across from him. I know this hasn't been... He turned the cup in his hands. I know I haven't been particularly... He stopped. This was the most she'd heard him struggle for words. He was a man who used words sparingly and deliberately, and watching him search for them was like watching someone look for a tool in the wrong drawer. I haven't been easy to work for, he said finally, or to live near. I know that. You've been a man who lost his wife, she said. He looked at her. That's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it. He was quiet. Outside the kitchen window, the snow was dripping from the barn roof in the slightly warmer air of late February, a steady, irregular drip that was the first sound of a season not yet arrived. Eleanor used to say I was better at working the land than working with people, he said. She wasn't wrong. She left me a note about it, Abigail said. He looked up sharply. She said you wouldn't ask for help, Abigail said. She said not to give up on you. She said it matter-of-factly, not performing it, just telling him a thing that was true. I haven't. I won't. Something moved in his face. Not dramatically. This was Gideon Mercer, who did nothing dramatically. A slight shift, a settling, like a wall under sufficient accumulated pressure finally deciding to lean rather than stand straight. He looked at his coffee. She was something, he said very quietly. Eleanor was something. I know, Abigail said. I know her a little, I think, through the notes. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. That sounds like her. He drank his coffee. She would have liked you, he said without looking up, and Abigail heard the echo of Hannah's words and felt the coincidence of it land somewhere precise and important inside her chest. She didn't say anything. She drank her coffee. They sat at the table while the snow dripped from the barn roof and the light in the kitchen went to that particular afternoon quality that meant the day had turned its corner and it was ordinary and it was not. And she was aware of something accumulating between them that neither of them had a name for yet and that neither of them was trying to name, which was the right approach at the right time. She thought, I came here with $2 and a letter that said I wasn't wanted. She thought, look at this kitchen. Look at this table. Look at this man sitting across from me drinking his coffee with the weight on his shoulders slightly less than it was in November. She thought, I stayed. I just kept staying. The dripping from the barn roof was steady and unrhythmic, and it was the sound of ice becoming water, which is the sound of something hard slowly, under sufficient warmth, letting go. She got up to start supper. He sat at the table a while longer. At some point the children began filtering in from their afternoon, Willie loud, Peter quiet, Nora asking if there were biscuits, Thomas coming to stand near Abigail at the stove in his particular way, close enough to be company. Gideon stayed at the table. He stayed for supper. He didn't retreat to the barn after. He sat in the sitting room that evening while Abigail read and the children arranged themselves around the room. And he read the newspaper, old, weeks old, Newspapers always arrived late this far out. And at some point, Nora migrated from his hand briefly on the top of her head and went back to his paper. Abigail watched this from the corner of her eye and said nothing and kept reading. The ice was letting go. Not all of it, not fast, but the process, once it starts, moves in one direction only. She kept that in her mind through the rest of the winter. Through the cold that would not fully break for another 6 weeks, through the hard days and the small reversals, through Hannah's uneven thawing, and Thomas's slowly expanding vocabulary directed at her and Willie's return to his normal volume. Through the mornings she was tired before she started, and the evenings when the ache in her hands from cold and work made her just want to stop. She was not supposed to be a person who mattered here. She was supposed to cook and clean and survive, $2 in her pocket, and a letter that said go away. But Eleanor Mercer had known something, writing in her Bible and her recipe books, and her linen closet, and wherever else the notes were waiting that Abigail hadn't found yet. She had known that the person who came after her would need to know that this family was worth the staying. She'd been right. Abigail was staying. March came in like something trying to prove a point. The snow that had seemed so permanent through January and February began pulling back from the south-facing slopes, leaving the ground beneath it dark and soft and smelling of something alive again. And the children responded to this the way children respond to any loosening of constraint, with energy that had nowhere adequate to go. Willie was outside from dawn to dusk, and sometimes had to be physically retrieved for meals. Nora rediscovered the existence of mud with an enthusiasm that destroyed 2 pairs of stockings in the first week. Even Peter, who lived mostly in his head, started spending his afternoons at the edge of the creek that ran along the east pasture, watching the ice break up with the focused attention of someone conducting research. The house breathed differently in March. Literally. The doors could be left open without it being an act of self-destruction, and the air that came through was cold still but had something green underneath it, a promise rather than a threat. Abigail aired out every room she could reach and washed the winter out of the curtains, and felt for the first time since November that the walls of the house were not something she was sheltering behind, but something she was simply living within. She found the last note in mid-March. It was in the garden, which she'd started working on, the kitchen garden behind the house that had gone completely to seed and tangle through the months of Eleanor's illness and the 14 months after. She'd been turning the soil one afternoon, working out the winter compaction, and her spade hit something that wasn't a rock. A small tin box, the kind used for tobacco, sealed against moisture. She opened it there in the garden with dirty hands and found a single folded piece of paper inside, the handwriting the same as all the others, and she sat down on the cold ground right there and read it. This one I buried because it's for later, not for the hard days. I left enough notes for those. This one is for when it's not as hard anymore, for when you've been here long enough to wonder if you're allowed to want things for yourself. You are. You came here for them. I know that. But you're allowed to have your own reasons for staying now. You're allowed to be happy here. You're allowed to let him see you. Not just the capable hands and the steady presence, but the actual you. He won't know how to begin it. He never did. That part was always mine, but he is worth the beginning. If you've made it this far, you already know that. Be happy. You've earned it. E. Abigail sat in the half-turned garden with the tin box in her lap, and the paper in her hands and the sky above her going from white to the first real blue it had managed in months. And she stayed there long enough that Nora came to the back door and called her name twice before she answered. She folded the note. She put it with the others, in the inside pocket of her coat, where she'd been carrying them all since February without quite deciding why. She picked up her spade and went back to work. She thought about what Eleanor had written. Let him see you. She thought about 4 months of careful professionalism, of making herself useful and staying in her lane and not reaching past what the situation asked of her. She thought about the kitchen table in February, the dripping roof, 2 people drinking coffee in a silence that had shifted into something neither of them named. She thought about the way Gideon Mercer looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Not the surface look of a man assessing whether his household is running properly, but something different, something with more weight behind it, that he pulled back the moment she turned toward him. She was not going to do anything about any of it, not yet. What Eleanor described was not a thing you rushed, and she had enough clarity about herself to know she had always been better at staying than at beginning, but she let herself know it was there. That was something. The illness started on a Wednesday. Nora was the first. She came down to breakfast looking wrong. Not the bright, energetic Nora of the past several weeks, but something pale and subdued, moving carefully as if she was carrying something fragile. Abigail put a hand to her forehead at the table and felt the heat there and said, "You're going back to bed." "I'm not sick," Nora said, with zero conviction. "Back to bed," Abigail said. She got Nora settled and thought, one child, a fever, probably the transition from winter, happens every year. She made broth and brought it upstairs and watched the girl sleep with the particular restless quality of fever sleep, turning and turning. By Thursday morning, Thomas had it. By Thursday evening, Willie. She stood in the upstairs hallway with 3 sick children behind 3 doors, and her hand pressed flat against the wall, and she took 2 deliberate breaths, and then she went back to work, because that was what there was to do. The illness was not a simple fever. It had a persistence to it that made her uneasy. The temperature didn't break and come back. It simply stayed, grinding and sustained, the children listless and aching and unable to keep much food down. She knew enough to know that this was the kind of illness that required watching, the kind that could go either way. She'd seen it before. She'd been 7 when a fever like this had moved through her neighborhood in Columbus, and she knew what happened when you stopped paying attention. She did not stop paying attention. She organized the care with the methodical focus she brought to everything that mattered. Broth simmered on the stove in continuous rotation, cool cloths changed out every hour, temperatures checked with the back of her wrist against foreheads because there was no thermometer, fluids pressed steadily and without negotiation. She was up every 2 hours through the first night, moving between rooms in the dark house with the lamp turned low, checking, adjusting, checking again. Gideon was there too. He was not a man who retreated when his children needed him. She'd understood that about him even in the early months. And he took the midnight hours while she took the earlier ones, and they passed each other in the hall at 2 in the morning like people sharing a watch, exchanging information in low voices. Willie's temperature is up. Thomas kept the broth down. Nora's restless. The transfer of facts between 2 people doing the same urgent work. By the second night, she was running on 4 hours of accumulated sleep and the specific nervous energy that the body produces when it understands that stopping is not currently an option. She made mistakes. She knocked over the water pitcher in Thomas's room at 3 in the morning, which woke him and alarmed him, and she had to calm him back down while mopping up the floor with one hand and holding his in the other, whispering that it was all right. She just wasn't paying attention. She was sorry. She was right here. "Don't go," Thomas said, half asleep. "I'm right here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He went back to sleep holding her hand, and she sat on the edge of his small bed in the dark for another 20 minutes until she was sure he was out, and then she went to check on the other 2. On the 3rd morning, Peter came down with it. She heard him at dawn, a sound from his room that was different from the ordinary sounds of waking, and she went in and found him sitting on the edge of his bed with his engineering manual in his lap and his face the same gray-white the others had gone. He looked at her with the particular dignity of a 10-year-old boy who is determined not to be sick. "I'm all right," he said. "You're not," she said. "And that's fine. Lie down." "I need to—" "The machines will wait," she said. "Lie down, Peter." He lay down. She got the covers over him and felt his forehead, and the heat there was significant. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since Thursday. 4 children down, the illness not breaking, day 3 with no meaningful improvement. The nearest doctor in Laramie, which was 2 hours by wagon on a good road, and the road was not currently good. She went downstairs and found Gideon at the kitchen table with his coffee, and she sat down across from him and told him plainly what she was looking at. 4 of them now, she said. "The fever isn't moving. It's been 3 days for the first 3. She put her hands flat on the table. "I don't think we're at crisis yet, but I think we could get there. I need to know if you want to send for a doctor." He looked at his coffee. She knew the calculation he was making. 2 hours to Laramie, 2 hours back, a day lost each way. The road still rough from the snowmelt, the doctor not certain to be available. And the money, which she didn't mention because she didn't need to. "What do you think?" he asked. She appreciated that he asked. 4 months ago, he would have made the decision in his own head and delivered the result. "I think another day," she said. "If there's no improvement by tomorrow night, we send Eli." He nodded. All right. And I need more willow bark if you have it, and chamomile. And I need someone to cant, because I can't be in 4 rooms at once. I'll do the broth, he said. You also need to sleep. So do you. They looked at each other. The absurdity of 2 exhausted people telling each other to sleep, neither of whom was going to take the advice, was present in the silence between them. Take turns, he said. 4 hours each. Fine, she said. You first, he said. I'll watch them till noon. She wanted to argue. She was too tired to argue effectively. She went upstairs and lay down on her bed with her boots still on and was unconscious in approximately 4 minutes. She dreamed about her parents, which she hadn't done in a long time. Her mother's hands, specifically, the shape of them, the way they moved when she cooked, efficient and knowing. She woke up at noon with the impression of those hands still clear in her mind and the sound of Gideon's voice somewhere down the hall, low and steady, talking to one of the children. She lay still for a moment and listened to the sound of it without being able to make out the words, just the voice, just the steadiness of it. A man sitting with his sick child and talking him through it. She got up and went back to work. The 4th day was the hardest. Thomas's fever spiked in the afternoon to the point where she stripped the blankets off him and put cool cloths on his forehead and chest and neck, and sat beside him and did not let herself think about what she knew fevers could do when they went high enough, because thinking about it would not help, and the work in front of her was specific and required everything she had. She talked to him while she worked, not meaningful things, just words, her voice continuous and even, telling him about the garden she was putting in, about the creek where Peter watched the ice break, about the rabbit Willie had been tracking before the February blizzard that she'd heard was back near the east fence, that foolish rabbit still out there. Thomas's eyes were open and focused on her face, which was better than them not being focused. She kept talking, she kept changing the cloths. She kept her hand on his and counted his breathing, which was fast but regular. Gideon appeared in the doorway at some point. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there. He was watching her with Thomas, his shoulder against the doorframe, his face doing something she felt rather than saw because she was focused on the boy. He came in and stood at the other side of the bed. He put his hand on Thomas's head, a different kind of touch from hers, heavier, the hand of the parent rather than the caretaker, a father's hand. Thomas looked at him. Hey, bud, Gideon said quietly. Hey, Pa, Thomas said. Very small. Gideon sat on the other side of the bed and they both stayed. After a while, Thomas's eyes closed and the breathing evened out slightly, and the fever, gradually, with no particular drama, began pulling back from its worst. She became aware, sitting across from Gideon in Thomas's small room with the boy between them, of how completely ordinary this was and how completely it was not. She had come here as a hired woman. She was sitting at a sick child's bedside at 4 p.m. of the 4th day of an illness that had taken down 4 of 5 children, across from a man she had learned like a language over 4 months, both of them too tired to maintain any pretense of distance, and it felt like the most natural thing she'd ever done. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. They sat with the sick child between them until he was sleeping properly, and then they went to check the others. By the 5th morning, Nora's fever broke. She heard it from down the hall, heard Nora's voice, different, higher, the voice of a child who has come back from somewhere and is surprised to find herself returned. Abigail came in to find Nora sitting up in bed with her hair a disaster and her face damp and her eyes clear for the first time in days. I'm hungry, Nora announced with the authority of someone making a significant statement. Abigail put her hand to the girl's forehead. Cool. Relatively cool. You can have broth, she said. I want biscuits. You can have broth, Abigail said again, and she was smiling, which she hadn't done in 4 days, and Nora saw it and smiled back with the slightly dazed expression of the recently recovered. Willie followed by afternoon. Thomas by the next morning. Peter, who'd had it last and therefore was still in the grip of it when the others were climbing back out, turned the corner on the 7th day, sitting up and asking for his engineering manual before he'd had anything to eat, which she took as an excellent sign. She was in the kitchen making a proper meal for the first time in a week. Real food, not just broth, something that would put something back in all those small depleted bodies. When she heard Hannah behind her, she turned. Hannah was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had been the only one of the 5 children who hadn't gotten sick, running messages and fetching water, and handling the household tasks that had fallen entirely away during the crisis, doing all of it without being asked or directed. She had aged visibly in the past 7 days, not in a bad way, but in the way of someone who has been tested and found they could stand up to it and is now slightly different on the other side. She was looking at Abigail with an expression that had nothing of the old guardedness in it. Nothing crossed or armored or provisionally withholding. She was just looking at her, straightforwardly, the way you look at a person you have decided to see. "You didn't sleep," Hannah said. "I slept some." "Not enough." "No," Abigail admitted, "not enough." Hannah came into the kitchen and picked up the knife Abigail had been using and started cutting the carrots without any discussion, taking over a portion of the work with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for permission and had decided she didn't need it. They worked side by side in a silence that was completely different from the silences of November and December. Not armed, not wary, just 2 people in a kitchen. After a while, Hannah said, "I was scared." "I know," Abigail said. "Not just about them getting sicker." A pause. The knife moved steadily. "I was scared you'd leave, that it would be too much and you'd go." Abigail stopped what she was doing and looked at her. Hannah kept cutting carrots, her eyes on the board. "I wasn't going to leave," Abigail said. "I know that now." Hannah set the knife down. She looked at the carrots. She looked at her own hands. "I didn't know it then." She looked up. "I should have known it, from what you did in the storm, I should have known, but I was scared anyway." "That makes sense," Abigail said. "I didn't make it easy for you," Hannah said, "when you first came. I know I didn't." "No," Abigail said honestly. "You didn't." "I'm sorry," Hannah said. She said it the way she did everything, directly, without softening or embellishment. An apology with no performance around it. Abigail looked at this girl, 16 years old, who had run a household for 14 months and held her family together with her own will, and then held it together again for the past week while Abigail fought the illness floor by floor. And she thought, Eleanor was right. She is so much braver than she knows. "You don't have to do all of it by yourself anymore," Abigail said. "I'm here. I'm going to stay here. That doesn't take anything away from you. It just means there are 2 of us." Hannah looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up the knife and went back to the carrots. And after a moment she said, in a voice that was entirely matter-of-fact, "The onions need cutting, too." "I see them," Abigail said. They made supper together, and it was imperfect. Hannah oversalted the broth, and Abigail burned the bottom of the cornbread slightly. And it was the best meal she'd made in 4 months. She was washing the dishes that evening, the children in bed, and the house quiet for the first time in a week, when she heard the back door and felt the cold air, and Gideon came into the kitchen. He'd been in the barn late, as he often was, and he looked like a man who'd been running on insufficient sleep for a week and was beginning to feel the full weight of the debt. He looked at the clean kitchen and the banked stove and the dishes drying on the rack, and then he looked at her. "They're all right," she said, because that was the first thing. Everyone kept supper down. Thomas asked for his horse. Something went out of his shoulders. Not all of it. There would always be something he carried that didn't fully leave, but enough. He leaned against the counter and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and when he dropped them, his face was more open than she had ever seen it. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. He was doing the searching for words thing again, the wrong drawer thing. "What you did this week? What you've done all winter?" He looked at her directly. "I don't have the right words for it." "You don't need them," she said. "I do," he said. "Abigail." It was the first time he'd used her given name. Not Miss Hartwell. Not a functional address. Just her name, the one she'd had her whole life, coming from his mouth in this kitchen where she'd spent 4 months learning everything worth knowing about this family. She went still. "I know what you are to this family," he said. "I know what you've been, all winter. I know what it cost you, and I know you didn't—" He stopped again. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "The children, they're different because of you. Thomas talks. Nora laughs. Hannah," he looked at the window, the dark glass. "Hannah let me hug her last week while the kids were sick. She hasn't, not since Eleanor. That's you. That's what you did." She didn't say anything. She was holding very still the way you hold still when something fragile is happening and you don't want to break it. I was going to wait, he said. I thought I should wait longer. I thought it was too soon, or... He set the cup down. I'm not good at this. I know I'm not good at this. Eleanor always said I was better at showing things than saying them, and she was right, but I think this one needs to be said. Gideon, she said quietly. I love you, he said. Just that. Plainly, the way he said most things, without decoration. I don't know when it started exactly. Somewhere between the bread and the storm. Somewhere in there. I love you, and I want you to stay, not as the hired woman, not as the housekeeper, but as... He stopped. He looked at his hands. I know I'm asking you to take on something enormous. 5 children and a ranch and a man who doesn't know how to say things properly. I know that. And you didn't come here for any of that. No, she said. I didn't. He looked up. I came here with $2 and a letter saying I wasn't wanted, she said. I expected to survive the winter and figure out the rest later. She held his gaze. I didn't expect this family. I didn't expect any of this. She took a breath. I didn't expect you. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a nightbird called once from somewhere near the barn. I'm not going to pretend it hasn't been hard, she said. It has been. Some days it still is. And I know what you carry. I know it doesn't go away. What you lost. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. She looked at him. But I'm already here. I'm already in this. All the way in, have been for months. Saying yes to you doesn't change anything about what I already feel. It just makes it honest. He looked at her for a long moment. Is that a yes? That's a yes, she said. He crossed the kitchen to her, unhurried, and he took her hands in his. Her worn, work-roughened hands, which he held the way you hold something you intend to keep. And he looked at her the way she'd seen him look at his land sometimes, the east pasture in the early morning light, with a kind of quiet ferocity that was the closest he got to reverence. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She understood his particular language well enough by now. But they stood like that in the kitchen, his hands around hers, for a while. Long enough for the fire to settle and the night bird to call again from its tree near the barn, and for something 4 months in the making to finally, without apology, become what it had been becoming all along. She thought about the tin box in the garden. Be happy. You've earned it. She thought, Eleanor, you were something. She was. And 2 days later, before Abigail had told anyone, before she and Gideon had figured out how they were going to explain any of it, the back door opened at breakfast and a woman walked into the kitchen who made the air in the room change quality immediately, the way a sudden drop in temperature changes the air. Aunt Clara. She was exactly as Abigail remembered, thin and composed with a traveling coat and a face built for disapproval, looking around the Mercer kitchen with the expression of someone confirming their worst expectations. Her eyes found Abigail at the stove, and she said, without preamble, without greeting, I've come to take you home. The kitchen went absolutely silent. Willie stopped chewing. Nora's spoon halted midway to her mouth. Thomas looked at Clara and then at Abigail with a speed that was almost physical, like a question thrown across the room. Hannah stood up from her chair, not dramatically, just stood up, and her face went to the expression Abigail hadn't seen in months. The crossed arms, the locked jaw. Not directed at Abigail, directed at the woman in the doorway. Clara looked around the table at the children, and then back at Abigail. This is no life for you, she said, cooking and cleaning for someone else's family in the middle of nowhere. You have an opportunity to come back to Columbus, to make something of yourself. You sent me here, Abigail said. Clara's composure flickered. I was trying to provide you with... You needed the room, Abigail said. She wasn't angry. She was remarkably calm, which was perhaps more unsettling than anger would have been. That's what it was. You can say so. Clara pressed her lips together. Abigail, you're 19 years old. Your whole life is here, Abigail said. A silence. Excuse me, Clara said. My life is here. Abigail set down the spoon she'd been holding. She looked at her aunt with the clear eyes of someone who had spent 4 months figuring out exactly what mattered to her and was no longer uncertain about the list. I'm not going back to Columbus. I'm staying on this ranch. I'm staying with this family. A beat. I'm marrying Gideon Mercer." She had not planned to say that last part yet. It came out because it was true and because the room required it, because Clara needed to understand the full shape of what she was looking at when she looked at this kitchen. Heavy boots on the back porch steps. The door opened and Gideon came in, reading the room in the way he read the weather. Quickly, accurately, without needing to be told what he was looking at. His eyes went to Clara, then to Abigail, then back. Clara turned to him. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Clara Whitfield, Abigail's aunt. I believe there's been some confusion here that I'd like to—" "Yeah, there's no confusion," Gideon said. He came to stand beside Abigail, not in front of her, not blocking her, beside her. "Abigail's told me her decision. I'd ask you to respect it." Clara looked at the two of them standing together. She looked at the table full of children, all of whom were watching her with varying degrees of the same expression, which was the expression of people who have decided which side they're on. She looked at Hannah, who had not sat back down. Whatever argument she'd prepared, it met the room and found nowhere to go. "You would throw away everything," she started. "I'm not throwing anything away," Abigail said. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." She looked at her aunt, this woman who had turned back into the house before she'd reached the end of the walk, who had pressed a letter into her hand like closing a transaction. "You taught me what it feels like to be sent away," she said. "I know what that is now. I know what this is too. They're not the same thing." Clara stood in the kitchen doorway for another moment. She was a woman who was not used to being at the end of an argument, and the experience seemed to fit badly. Then she looked at Abigail one last time, something in the look that was complicated, that maybe had something like recognition in it, or something like shame, and she said stiffly, "I see your mind is made up." "It is," Abigail said. Clara left. The kitchen stayed silent for a full 3 seconds after the door closed. Then Willie said with feeling, "Good riddance," and Hannah said, "Willie," with less than her usual force, and Thomas got down from his chair and came and stood next to Abigail and put his small hand in hers without saying anything at all. She looked down at him. He looked up at her. "Is she gone?" he asked. "She's gone," Abigail said. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his breakfast. She stood in the kitchen with her hand still warm from his, and Gideon's shoulder was solid and certain beside her. And outside the March morning was bright, and the snow was retreating further up the slopes each day. And somewhere in the kitchen garden, the soil she'd turned was waiting for seed. She had been the girl nobody wanted. She was still standing in the same room she'd been standing in, but everything else was different. Clara's wagon was not yet out of sight at the end of the road when Willie turned to Gideon and said, with the cheerful pragmatism of an 11-year-old who has processed a significant event and moved on, "So when's the wedding?" Gideon looked at him, looked at Abigail. The corner of his mouth moved in a way she had learned over 4 months to recognize as the closest he came to an unguarded smile. "We haven't exactly settled on that yet," he said. "Well, you should," Willie said, and went back to his breakfast with the air of a man who has contributed helpfully to a conversation and considers the matter handled. Nora looked at Abigail with wide eyes that had something luminous in them. "Are you really going to be our—" She stopped, recalibrating, because she was 8 and perceptive enough to know that some words carry weight. "Are you going to stay forever?" she asked instead. "That's the idea," Abigail said. Nora considered this with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and then she nodded once, decisive, and said, "Good," with a certainty that closed the subject entirely. Peter said nothing. He looked at the table and then at his hands and then at Abigail, and the look he gave her was the same one he'd given her the afternoon on the sitting room floor with the engineering manual, the look of someone checking to see if a thing was real before letting himself believe in it. She held his gaze steadily. He nodded, slow and small, and went back to his eggs. Thomas had not returned to his seat. He was still standing beside Abigail, not holding her hand anymore, but close, the way he was always close to things he wanted to keep near without making a production of it. She looked down at him. "Finish your breakfast," she said. "Okay," he said. He went and sat down. He ate his breakfast. Small and ordinary, a child doing what he was asked, and it was the most important thing she'd seen all morning. Hannah cleared the plates without a word when everyone was done. When Abigail came to help, she didn't wave her off, which was its own kind of statement. They worked side by side in the kitchen, and at some point Hannah said, quietly, so the others couldn't hear, She's not going to leave it alone, you know, your aunt. Probably not, Abigail said. Are you worried about it? Abigail thought about it honestly. No, she said. She wasn't. Clara had walked into this kitchen expecting to find a girl who was waiting to be retrieved, who had been quietly suffering through a temporary situation and would be grateful for the exit. She had found something else entirely. People like Clara revised their expectations when the alternative required too much effort, and pursuing Abigail across Wyoming would require considerable effort. She got what she came for, Abigail said. She knows where I stand. That's enough for her. Hannah absorbed this. Then, good. She handed Abigail a dish to dry, and they finished the washing up in the comfortable silence that had become the natural register of their mornings together. The wedding was 3 weeks later on a Saturday in early April when the mountains to the west still had their winter caps, but the south slope of the yard was showing the first tentative green, and the air smelled like something returning. They did it simply, in the front room of the ranch house with Eli as witness, and the 5 children arranged in a rough semicircle that kept shifting because Willie could not stand still, and Thomas kept migrating closer to Abigail until he was essentially standing on her feet. There was no elaborate ceremony. Gideon was not a man for elaborate anything, and Abigail had never in her life been the kind of person who put great stock in the performance of things versus the substance of them. A justice of the peace came out from the nearest town, a compact man named Hargrove who had clearly done this enough times in enough different circumstances to be unsurprised by any of it. He read the words. They said what needed to be said. Gideon put a ring on her finger, plain silver, nothing extravagant, and she loved it exactly as it was. When it was done, Willie let out a sound that was technically a cheer and elbowed Peter, who allowed himself a small, real smile. Nora took Abigail's hand immediately, the way she'd taken it that afternoon walking from the barn, casually and completely. Thomas put his small carved horse on the table as what appeared to be a wedding gift, which meant more to her than she could have explained. Eli shook Gideon's hand and then, apparently deciding that wasn't sufficient, shook Abigail's too, with a slightly baffled dignity that was entirely his own. Hannah stood to the side of all this, not quite in it. And when the noise had settled some, she came to Abigail and stood in front of her and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she opened her arms stiffly, like someone operating unfamiliar machinery, and Abigail stepped into it and they held each other briefly and imperfectly, neither of them the type for easy demonstrations. And it was exactly right. "Welcome to the family," Hannah said into her shoulder, dry and quiet. "You were already in it. Now it's just official." "I know," Abigail said. "Don't make it a thing," Hannah said, already pulling back. "I won't," Abigail said. Life on the ranch after that was not transformed the way stories sometimes suggest, not suddenly and completely different, not easier in every way. The work was still the work. The winters in Wyoming were still Wyoming winters. Gideon was still a man who showed things more readily than he said them, who could go an entire day nearly silent and consider it a productive day, who occasionally retreated into himself without quite meaning to and had to be given room to find his way back. Abigail was still a person who held things close before she trusted them, who could be stubborn in ways that were not always useful, who woke some morning still half expecting to find herself back in Clara's spare bedroom. Nobody in the Mercer house was fixed. That was the truth of it. You didn't lose someone like Eleanor and come out fixed on the other side. What you came out was different, carrying the loss as a permanent part of the weight you moved through the world with, lighter on some days than others, heavier when you weren't expecting it. Hannah still had nights when she woke at 2 a.m. and lay listening to the house breathe. Thomas still sometimes went very still and very interior in a way that meant he was somewhere else for a while and you just had to wait. Gideon still set his coffee cup down sometimes and looked at the window at nothing for long enough that Abigail would find a reason to put her hand on his shoulder in passing, not drawing attention to it, just reminding him she was there. These things didn't go away. She stopped expecting them to. What changed was the texture of the days. The way the house held the people in it differently. Not tightly, not anxiously, but with something easier running through it now, the way a piece of furniture that's been repaired and used long enough stops showing the repair. The laughter was real and often unexpected. The arguments were about ordinary things. The meals were sometimes burned and sometimes excellent, and nobody made much of either. Willie remained thoroughly himself, which meant permanently loud and permanently interesting and permanently finding things to report on. Peter built a small working model of a water wheel in May that actually turned in the creek current, and the look on his face when it worked was the kind of thing you file away to take out later. Nora's thumb habit finally ended sometime in June without announcement. Abigail simply noticed one day that it had been a while, and she let it be a while, and that was that. Thomas started school that fall, in the small schoolhouse 4 miles up the road. On the first morning, he stood at the door with his lunch pail and his face arranged in careful neutrality that she had learned to read as covering significant nerves. She crouched down to his level. "You'll be all right," she said. "What if nobody talks to me?" he asked. "Then you talk to someone else," she said. "You're good at talking when you decide to." He thought about this seriously. "What if I don't want to?" "Then you don't," she said, "but give it a chance first." He nodded, the same tight, short nod his father made. He went down the porch steps. At the bottom, he turned back. "Abigail." "Yeah." "Will you be here when I get back?" She held his gaze. "I'll be here," she said. He nodded again and went to where Gideon was waiting with the horse to ride him up the road. She stood on the porch and watched them go, and she thought, 5 months ago this child had not spoken to her. He had watched her from doorways and pressed himself against door frames and communicated in the careful, silent language of a boy who has learned that words can be taken from you by events you don't control. And now he was asking her to be there when he got back, with the easy trust of someone who has tested a thing enough to believe in it. That was the thing about staying. It was not dramatic. It did not arrive with music or revelation. It was just day after day of showing up, of being present and consistent and honest, of doing the next thing and the thing after that, until one morning a 5-year-old boy who hasn't talked to you in months asks you to wait for him, and you understand that the accumulated weight of ordinary days has quietly become something that holds. She understood things differently now than she had when she'd arrived in November, with her $2 and her cracked bag and her letter of disposal. She understood that worth is not conferred. It is not handed to you by the people who are supposed to love you, and therefore can be taken away when they stop. It is built, slowly, in the doing of things, in the staying, in the sitting on a frozen porch in the dark with a grieving child and pointing at stars, in the riding into a blizzard, in the 7 nights of fever watch. None of those things made her valuable. She was already valuable, but they were how she found it out. She understood something about love too, which she had been in the process of learning since the first note fell out of Eleanor's Bible. Love is not primarily a feeling, though it has feelings in it. It is a practice, a series of choices, the decision made every day to remain present to the people who need you, even when it is inconvenient and exhausting and they are pushing you away. Eleanor had known this. Eleanor had loved her family so specifically, so practically, so carefully that she had built a map of them and left it for a stranger to follow. That was not romance. That was something more durable than romance. Abigail was still learning it. She expected she would be learning it for a long time. The second crisis came in July, which was perhaps the cruelest timing because July in Wyoming is close to paradise. The mountains green-shouldered, the creek running clear and cold, the air having forgotten entirely what February means. It came the way illness comes, suddenly, after a deceptive period of ease. A fever moved through the region, different from the winter one, faster and more aggressive. And it hit the ranch in the form of Nora first, and then ricocheted through 3 of the other children inside 4 days. Peter was the only one who didn't take it, possibly because he spent most of his time outdoors, or possibly just luck. Abigail recognized the pattern from February and moved without hesitation into the same organized vigilance: the broth, the cloths, the temperature checks, the steady voice in the dark. But this time something was different. This time Hannah was sick too. Hannah, who had been the last one standing in February, who had run the household and kept everything intact while Abigail fought the illness floor by floor. Hannah went down on the 3rd day with a speed that alarmed Abigail because she knew, better than anyone, what it cost Hannah to go down. Hannah did not know how to be the one who needed care. She lay in her bed with her jaw set and her eyes too bright and refused the broth twice before Abigail sat on the edge of the bed and said with no room in it for argument, "You have been holding this family up for over a year. You are allowed to be sick. Drink the broth, Hannah." Hannah drank the broth. She looked at Abigail over the rim of the cup with eyes that were feverish and tired and something else underneath, something young, something that hadn't had enough practice at being looked after. "I know," Abigail said. "I keep thinking I should be doing something." "You're getting better," Abigail said. "That's what you're doing." Hannah was quiet. Then, "You should sleep. You look terrible." "Thank you," Abigail said. "I will. Later." Hannah made a sound that was exasperated and fond simultaneously, a sound Abigail had never heard from her before, and turned over and went to sleep. Gideon found Abigail in the hallway at midnight, sitting on the floor outside Hannah's room with her back against the wall and her eyes closed, not asleep, but resting because she hadn't gotten there yet. He crouched down in front of her without saying anything. She opened her eyes. "All of them are okay," she said immediately. "Hannah's fever broke an hour ago. The others are holding." He exhaled slowly. He looked at her. The dark circles, the set of her shoulders, the hands in her lap that were still for once because they were too tired to be otherwise. He sat down on the floor beside her, his back against the wall, the way she was sitting, and he reached over and took one of her hands and held it. They sat there in the midnight hallway outside Hannah's room while the house breathed around them, and she felt the warmth of his hand and thought, "This is what it is. This is actually what it is. Not the grand moments, not the kitchen declaration, not the wedding, not the blizzard. It's this. Two people sitting on the floor at midnight holding hands outside a sick child's room, too tired for anything but honesty, too invested to be anywhere else." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. They sat there until she actually did fall asleep, briefly, sitting up, and he let her because she needed it, and when she woke 20 minutes later, he was still there. Everyone recovered. Again. Imperfectly and slowly, and with the particular gratitude of people who have been returned from somewhere they didn't want to go. It was August when she knew. She knew before she said anything, carrying the knowledge around with her for 2 weeks, which was probably too long but felt necessary, felt like something she needed to understand privately before it became part of the larger shape of things. She told Gideon on a Tuesday evening, sitting on the porch in the last of the summer light, the mountains going gold above their dark pine shoulders. She said, "I'm expecting." He went very still. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was too large and complex for her to categorize. Not any one thing, but all of them at once, the same way Eleanor's bread had done something to his face that first time, the recognition of something that carried everything else inside it. "When?" he asked. "February," she said. "I think." He was quiet for a while. The light on the mountains shifted. Below them in the yard, Willie was doing something that involved more running than was strictly necessary, and somewhere in the house she could hear the murmur of Hannah's voice and Nora's response, the ordinary evening sounds of the house. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm better than fine." He took her hand, the same way he had in the midnight hallway, and held it. "A February baby," he said, "in Wyoming." "I know," she said. "That's going to be cold." "Most things worth doing are," she said. He looked at her with that quiet ferocity she'd come to know as the specific way he loved things. He brought her hand up and pressed it against his jaw for a moment, not kissing it, just holding it there, his eyes closed. Then he lowered it and looked back at the mountains. They sat there together while the light went from gold to the deep blue of a Wyoming summer evening, slow and extravagant, and she thought about the tin box in the garden, Eleanor's final note. "Be happy. You've earned it." She told the children at supper the following evening. She had thought about how to frame it, what words to use, how to read the room, and adjust. In the end, she just said it plainly, because this family had always responded best to plain. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. "In the winter. You're all going to have a brother or sister." The table processed this. Willie broke first, as he broke most things, with volume. "I call not sharing my room," he said, with immediate practical clarity. And Nora said, "You already don't share your room." And Willie said, "I know, I'm just saying it first." And then everyone was talking at once in the overlapping way of a family that has learned to be loud together. Thomas, in the middle of it all, tugged her sleeve. She leaned down. He put his mouth near her ear and said quietly, just for her, Is it going to stay? She pulled back to look at him. His face was serious and young and completely earnest, asking the question that was underneath the question. Not whether the baby would be healthy or wanted, but whether it would be permanent. Whether this, like other things, might be taken away. Yes, she said. It's going to stay. We all are. He considered her with his father's dark eyes. Then he nodded, the small, certain nod, and turned back to his supper. Hannah caught her eye from across the table. Something passed between them. The particular communication of two people who have been through enough together that words are increasingly optional. Hannah glanced at Thomas, then back at Abigail, and she gave a small nod of her own. One that said, I see it. I see what you did there. Good. The baby came in February as predicted, which meant it came in the cold. It was a girl, and she was loud from the start, which Willie took as a personal compliment, and the rest of the family took as simply the natural condition of being born into this household. They named her Clara, which surprised some people and surprised no one who understood that Abigail Mercer was not a woman who carried grudges, who understood that the aunt who had sent her away had also, in the exact same motion, sent her here. Every door that closes, and all of that. She didn't name the baby for her aunt as forgiveness exactly, or even as irony. She named her Clara because the name was one she'd had her whole life, and now it could mean something different. Names can do that, if you let them. They all came to see her the morning after, crowding into the room with the contained energy of children trying to be quieter than they are. Willie wanted to hold her immediately and had to be reminded that he needed to sit down first. Nora touched the baby's hand with one finger, reverently, as if she was something that might vanish. Peter looked at the baby and then at Abigail with an expression of genuine scientific interest that made her laugh, quietly, still sore. Thomas stood at the edge of the group and looked at his new sister for a long time. Then he looked at Abigail. She looks like you, he said. You think? Abigail said. He looked again, seriously. Around the eyes, he said. She's going to be stubborn. Gideon, standing in the doorway, made a sound that was unambiguously a laugh, which was rare enough that everyone turned to look at him. He looked back with the composure of a man pretending he hadn't done it. Abigail looked at him and thought, there it is. There's what was underneath all that long winter of a face. She had seen it in pieces over the months, the almost smile, the edge of warmth, the hand on Nora's head. But this was the full version, and it was worth every frozen morning, every burned porridge, every midnight hallway. She thought about what she had believed when she stepped off that train in Laramie in November, cold and alone and categorized as surplus. She had believed she was a person things happened to rather than a person who made things happen. She had believed that belonging was something other people were given, and she was not. She had believed, in the way you believe things that have been shown to you enough times, that she was the sum of what the people who were supposed to want her had decided she was worth. She had been wrong, not wrong in a triumphant way. This wasn't a story about proving people wrong, about rising from the ashes of their low opinions. It was simpler than that. She had been wrong the way anyone is wrong when they accept someone else's accounting of their value. The ledger was always theirs to keep. She just hadn't known it yet. She knew it now. Outside the bedroom window, the February morning was white and still and brilliant. The same implacable Wyoming sky that had pressed down on her the day she arrived. But she was looking at it from the inside now, from her own bed in her own house with her daughter in her arms and her family crowded into the room. The mountains were out there under their snow. The garden would come up in April. The creek would run high in the thaw. The ranch would demand everything the ranch always demanded, and she would give it because that was the work, and the work was hers. Eleanor's notes were still in the tin box in the kitchen. She had put them there in the fall, all of them together, and she had thought about what to do with them and decided to leave them where they were for now. Someday she might show them to the children. Someday Hannah might ask to read them. For now they were just there. A woman's careful love, kept safe in a little tin box, having done exactly what it was sent to do. She had arrived in the frozen Wyoming winter believing she was the girl no one wanted. She had been wrong about that too. She was the woman who had ridden into a blizzard and come back, who had sat with sick children through 7 nights, who had stood in her own kitchen and sent a woman away who thought she could be retrieved, who had found a dead woman's notes and followed them like a map to the place she was supposed to end up, who had stayed and stayed asking if they could name the next one something more exciting, and Hannah telling him there wasn't going to be a next one yet and he needed to go do his chores, and Willie saying he was just saying, and Thomas's voice below all of it, quiet and matter of fact, telling the baby she would get used to it. "It's always like this," Thomas said, "but it's okay. It's good, actually." Abigail looked down at her daughter, who was looking up at her with the unfocused, ancient-seeming gaze of the newborn, taking in whatever of the world was available at this range. "He's right," she told her. "It is." The baby blinked. Outside the window, the Wyoming winter held the land in its long, white grip, same as always. But there was something underneath it already, patient and certain, waiting for its turn. The same thing that came back every year without fail, without asking for permission. Spring. It always came.